Pilate was not a man who hesitated. He was the prefect of Judea, the representative of the greatest power the world knew at that time, and men like him did not hesitate. They administered, they judged, they signed, they executed. That was how the Roman Empire worked, with the cold precision of a machine that needed no emotions to operate, only efficiency, only order, only the certainty that Rome always had the last word. And yet, there is a moment in history where this man, this calculating prefect who had survived years in one of the empire's most challenging provinces, does something that no political analysis can fully explain. He writes 4 words in 3 languages, nails them above the head of a dying man, and when the most powerful religious leaders in Jerusalem approach him to ask him to change them, he looks at them and simply says, "What I wrote, I wrote." There is no negotiation, no revision, no politics. Just that sentence, as sharp as a wall, that shuts down the conversation forever. Let yourself consider this for a moment. Pontius Pilate was hardly known for his moral integrity. Historical texts, including the writings of the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, describe him as a corrupt man, cruel at times, and perfectly willing to cave to political pressure when the situation demanded it. He himself had caved that morning. He had declared that man innocent 3 times, tried to free him using the Passover custom, explored every available avenue, and finally caved because the crowd roared and because Caesar's throne outweighed his own conviction. That same man who had caved to pressure on the most important issue, who had handed over an innocent man for political expediency, that same man, suddenly, at the moment of writing the title for the cross, becomes immovable, utterly immovable. And no one, in centuries of reading the Gospel of John, seems to have paused long enough to consider this contradiction and ask why. There's something that happens when you read that passage with your eyes truly open, when you allow yourself to step outside the liturgy and enter the text with the same curiosity you would have when approaching a newly discovered ancient manuscript. The Gospel of John, in chapter 19, describes the scene with almost painful precision. Pilate had a title written and placed it on the cross. What was written was, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." And many of the Jews read this title because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the title was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. 3 languages, 3 versions of the same text. And then comes the reaction of the chief priests, who approach Pilate and say to him, "Don't write King of the Jews," but rather that he said, "I am King of the Jews." And Pilate responds with that phrase that has gone down in history, "What I wrote, I wrote." Scholars have debated the political significance of that inscription for centuries. Some say it was a mockery by Rome of the Jews, a coded message saying, "Look what happens to your kings." Others say it was a legal statement, the crime for which the man had been executed, as was customary in Roman crucifixions. Still others speak of evangelical irony, of how the Gospel of John constructs that moment as an unwitting proclamation of the deepest truth. All these readings are valid. They all have their place. But there is a dimension to this text that almost no one has publicly explored, a dimension that lives in the original language, in the Hebrew of those 4 words Pilate chose to describe the man hanging from the wood, and which, when read with the eyes of the Hebrew world, the world in which that inscription had to be understood by passers-by, produces something that has no name in any modern language. It produces that feeling that only exists when something too precise to be a coincidence is suddenly revealed, as if the fabric of time had been waiting for you to arrive at that moment to show you what was always there. The 4 Hebrew words are, Yeshua Hanatzri Vemelech HaYehudim, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. In Hebrew, as in many Semitic languages, the first letters of words carry enormous symbolic weight. This wasn't mere literary ornamentation. It was part of the very structure of Hebrew thought, of how this people understood language as something living, as an organism in which each letter had a function, a sound, a number, a meaning that went beyond the surface. Scribes, priests, Rabbis all read texts on multiple layers simultaneously. One was the literal layer, what the text said. Another was the allegorical layer, what the text represented. Another was the moral layer, what the text taught. And there was a fourth layer, called in the rabbinic tradition the level of sod, which was the hidden level, the level where language revealed truths that could not be said directly, only hinted at, only structured in such a way that whoever had ears to hear would hear. Yeshua Hanatzri Vemelech HaYehudim. Take the first letters of each of those 4 words in Hebrew. The first letter of Yeshua is Yod. The first letter of Hanatzri is He. The first letter of Vemelech is Vav. The first letter of HaYehudim is He. Yod, He, Vav, He. Let yourself pause on that. Because those 4 letters, in that exact order, are not a typographical coincidence, not an accident of grammar, not the product of linguistic chance by a Roman prefect writing in a language that was not his own. Those 4 letters are the most sacred name in the Hebrew tradition. They are the Tetragrammaton. They are the name that God revealed to Moses in the desert, the name that the priests pronounced once a year in the holiest place in the temple, the name that the scribes, when copying it into manuscripts, had to write with a new quill, with clean hands, with a prepared soul, the name that Jewish tradition considers so sacred that for centuries it was not spoken aloud, replaced by Adonai, by Hashem, by any other word that functioned as a veil between the human mouth and that reality that the 4 letters contained. And that name appears in the inscription on the cross, written by Pilate. Written in 3 languages, but only visible in one. Visible in Hebrew. Visible to the priests who approached to read it, to the Jews who passed by the site because it was near the city, as the text states with almost calculated precision. Visible to precisely those people who knew what those 4 letters meant. And when the chief priests approach Pilate and ask him to change it, when they tell him not to write it like this, but in another way, when they place all the religious authority of the most powerful institution in Jerusalem behind that request, Pilate, that man who had yielded on everything important that very morning, says, "What I wrote. I'm not going to ask you to accept any theological interpretation of this moment. What I want is for you to inhabit that space for a moment, to feel the weight of what is happening in that text. Because there is something in the structure of John's narrative that cannot be explained solely with the tools of literary criticism or historical political analysis. John was Jewish. He wrote for an audience that included Jews and Gentiles who knew the Hebrew context. And when he chose to narrate that specific episode, when he chose to preserve that conversation between the priests and Pilate, when he chose to record Pilate's response with such precision, he knew what he was leaving in the text. He knew what whoever read those 4 Hebrew words would find. He knew the name was there. Imagine for a moment the scene from the perspective of the high priests. These are men raised on the Torah from childhood. They know Hebrew not as an everyday language, but as a sacred one, the language of Scripture, the language in which God had spoken. When they approach to read that inscription and see the 4 initial letters of those 4 words forming that name, what they feel is not merely political discomfort. What they feel is something bordering on holy terror and profound rage, because that name was not used like this. That name was not placed on a cross. That name was not displayed at a public execution for any passerby to read. That name lived within the Holy of Holies, in the whisper of the high priest on the Day of Atonement, in the most carefully preserved scrolls. And suddenly there it was, in wood, nailed to a dead or dying man, at the city gate, in the language of the people, for all to see. That explains the urgency. That explains why the priests weren't merely annoyed, but went directly to Pilate. That explains the intensity of that brief conversation that John preserved with an economy of words that only makes the text more powerful. It wasn't just politics. It was something more ancient. It was the contact of the sacred with that which should not touch it, or perhaps, depending on how you read the text, it was the fulfillment of something that had been promised long before Pilate existed, long before Rome existed, From the earliest days when that name was revealed to a man in the desert before a burning bush that was not consumed. To grasp the full weight of this, we need to go much further back. We need to go back to the moment that name was first uttered, or more precisely, to the moment it was revealed as a name. Because there is something extraordinary about the story of the Tetragrammaton that centuries of religious tradition, both Jewish and Christian, have obscured with layers of reverence so thick that it is sometimes difficult to see the original text clearly. Moses is in the desert, on Mount Horeb, and he sees a bush that burns without being consumed. He approaches because the vision draws him in, and from the bush comes a voice that speaks to him, that calls him by name, that tells him who he is, that tells him what he is going to ask him to do. And Moses, who at that moment is an 80-year-old man who has spent 40 of those years as a shepherd in the desert after fleeing Egypt, asks a question that seems simple but is actually one of the most profound questions in the entire biblical text. He says to the voice, "Look, if I go to the children of Israel and tell them that the God of their fathers has sent me, and they ask me what his name is, what shall I tell them?" Here, I want you to notice something important. Moses doesn't ask who you are. He doesn't ask what you want. He doesn't ask how I'm going to do this. He asks for the name. And that question has a cultural context that the modern reader almost always overlooks. In the ancient world of the Middle East, and specifically in the Hebrew world, the name wasn't an arbitrary label. The name was the essence. The name was the nature. To know the name of something or someone was to understand what that something or someone was at its most fundamental depth. The Egyptian priests, with whom Moses had grown up because he was raised in the Pharaoh's court, believed that knowing the true name of a god was to access its power. And in the Hebrew tradition, although the understanding was different, the name of God wasn't a mere sound accident either. It was a revelation of nature. The answer that comes from the burning bush is one of the most studied, debated, and profound phrases in the entire biblical text. In the original Hebrew, the answer is Ehyeh, Asher, Ehyeh. The most common translation is I am who I am, but that translation, while valid, captures only one dimension of those three words. The Hebrew verb haya, from which Ehyeh comes, does not have the temporal rigidity of the English verb ser, to be. In Hebrew, being, existing, and becoming are contained within the same semantic field. Ehyeh Asher. Ehyeh could equally be translated as I am who I am, or I will be what I will be, or I am being what I am being, or I will always be what I have always been. Indeterminacy is not a weakness of the language. It is the answer itself. That is to say, you cannot place me within any category you already have. You cannot compare me to any God you already know. You cannot use your existing frameworks to understand what I am. I am the very source of being, and the name I give you to say it is not a description but an approximation. And then comes the Tetragrammaton. Right after that declaration, in the same text of Exodus, God tells Moses, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, YHWH, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial throughout all generations. Yod, He, Vav, He." 4 letters that, in the original pronunciation which the centuries have obscured beyond recognition, contained the same semantic field as the verb haya, being in all its temporal forms simultaneously. The present that includes the past and the future. Existence that has no exterior, no before or after, that simply is. This is my name forever. That's what the text said. This is my memorial from generation to generation, and for centuries that name was central to the religious practice of Israel. The Psalms are full of it. The prophets used it with a naturalness that is hard for us to imagine today, because for them it wasn't a word too sacred to pronounce. It was the name of someone with whom they had a relationship. Jeremiah spoke to him in the temple and in the fields. Isaiah saw him in visions that left him powerless. Habakkuk called out to him in despair. Psalm 22 calls him with a cry that begins with abandonment, and ends with a proclamation. That name lived in the everyday language of faith, not locked away in the silence of reverence, but active, spoken, invoked, sung. The moment when the name began to disappear from spoken language is not easy to date precisely, but historians and Hebrew textual scholars place the process in the centuries following the Babylonian exile, and more clearly in the Second Temple period, roughly between the 5th century BCE and the 1st century CE. In that long process, reverence for the name grew into a practice of silence. Scribes continued to write it in manuscripts, but with ever-increasing ritual care. Readers, upon encountering it in the text, began to substitute it with Adonai, meaning my Lord, or with Hashem, which simply means the name. And when the time came to make the first great translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the Septuagint, the translators chose to replace the Tetragrammaton with Kyrios, Lord, the very word they used to address people of authority. Here I want you to notice something important. That process of substitution, which began with the intention of protecting what was sacred, had a consequence that no one fully planned for. When the New Testament was written, it was written primarily in Greek, and the Tetragrammaton was no longer present in the Greek Old Testament texts that the New Testament authors quoted. The name had been replaced by Kyrios, Lord. And when Jesus, or Paul, or any other New Testament author quoted Scripture or spoke of God, they used that Greek vocabulary, which was now the available vocabulary. The name that had been central for centuries had been veiled so thickly that, for many readers of later generations, it had simply vanished. They didn't erase it maliciously. They covered it with love. But the effect was similar. And yet, at that specific moment, on that specific morning in Jerusalem, in the year historians approximate as 30 to 33 CE, a Roman official, who knew neither the Torah nor the tradition nor the sacred weight of those 4 letters, took a wooden board and wrote on it 4 Hebrew words beginning with Yod, he, Vav, he, and he nailed it above the head of the condemned man. And when they asked him to change it, he said no. What I wrote, I wrote. Consider the historical dimension of that moment. The temple in Jerusalem still existed. The priestly system still functioned. The high priest still entered the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement and pronounced the name in the only context in which it was permitted to be uttered. The tradition was still alive. And in that context, in that city, in that year, the name appeared publicly, displayed, visible, without reverence, without ritual, without a veil, on a cross that stood near the city for all to see, so that the priests who guarded that name so carefully could read it as they passed by, so that the Passover pilgrims who had come from all parts of the Jewish world could see it written on that man. Christian theology has interpreted this moment in many ways throughout the centuries. Some church fathers saw in the inscription in 3 languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, a symbol of the universality of the message, for the people of the promise, for the world of culture, and for the world of power. Others read Pilate's refusal to change the text as a sign of divine sovereignty, which used even its adversaries to proclaim truths they themselves did not understand. And this latter interpretation connects with something the biblical text does repeatedly, something that runs like an underground river from Genesis to Revelation, and which could be summarized as follows. God speaks through what he does not control. Think of Balaam. That's exactly what happens in the story of that Moabite prophet in the book of Numbers. Balak, king of Moab, hires him to curse Israel. Balaam accepts the commission, but before leaving, he receives instructions not to go. Then he receives instructions to go, but to say only what he is told. And when he finally arrives at the place from which he is to pronounce the curse, he opens his mouth, and blessings come out. 4 times. 4 oracles that, instead of cursing Israel, bless it with words that the New Testament writers understood as prophetic, including that phrase about the star that would come out of Jacob. Balaam didn't want to say that. Balak didn't want to hear that. But the text records it as something Balaam was forced to utter without fully understanding it. Biblical tradition is replete with this pattern. There is Cyrus in Isaiah, the Persian king who did not know the God of Israel, yet was called by that name in prophecy the Anointed One, the Messiah, the one who would liberate the people from the Babylonian exile. There is Caiaphas, the high priest who, in the Gospel of John, says that it is better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. And John himself comments that Caiaphas did not say this of his own volition, but rather, as high priest that year, he prophesied unknowingly. And here, there is Pilate, a man who did not believe in the God of Israel, who did not know the meaning of those 4 letters, who chose those 4 Hebrew words because they expressed the condemned man's charge, and who, in writing them down, formed the name that this same man had uttered throughout his life, the name his disciples used to pray, the name that the prophets had imbued with meaning for centuries. What I wrote, I wrote. That phrase carries a weight that grows the longer you dwell on it. Because in the context of everything we've explored, Pilate's refusal to examine the inscription isn't just a moment of political stubbornness, not just a petty act of wounded pride from an official unwilling to yield to religious pressure. It's the closing of something. It's a door that shuts and never reopens. It's the seal upon a text that, in the language where the name was visible, said something no human decree could undo. And here I want to turn the reflection to something that many believers, both Jewish and Christian, have felt, but perhaps haven't been able to fully articulate. When you read the Bible in its original language, when you approach the Hebrew text without the filters of centuries of translation and institutional tradition, you find something that translations can't always capture. You find a language that operates on multiple layers simultaneously, that is both literal and symbolic, that has an internal coherence that transcends any human being's capacity for planning. The writers of the various books of the Bible were separated by centuries, by cultures, by languages, by completely different historical circumstances. And yet, when you read the complete text, when you read Genesis alongside the Gospel of John, when you read Exodus alongside the letter to the Hebrews, when you read the Psalms alongside Revelation, you find structures of meaning that respond to one another with a precision that defies purely human explanation. The name is one of those threads that run through the entire text. It appears in Genesis when humankind began to call upon the name of YHWH. It appears in Exodus as a fundamental revelation of the divine nature. It appears in Leviticus as something that cannot be profaned. It appears in Deuteronomy as something that dwells in the temple. It appears in the Psalms as a refuge, as a fortress, as the name upon which trust is built. It appears in the prophets as the center of the people's identity and as the seal of future promises. And then, in the darkest moment of the history of the people who guarded that name appears on a cross, written by a foreigner, visible to all, impossible to erase, because the man who could erase it chose not to. There is a phrase of Jesus in the Gospel of John that takes on a completely different dimension when you read it in light of all this. In chapter 17, in the prayer Jesus utters just before being arrested, he says, "Father, I have revealed your name to those whom you gave me out of the world. They were yours, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word." And later in the same prayer he says, "I have made your name known to them, and will continue to make it known." The name, not the attributes, not the characteristics, not the philosophical properties, the name. And in the context of the Hebrew world in which those words were spoken, to reveal the name of God was not simply to speak of God, it was to reveal his nature, his character, his presence. It was to make visible what was veiled. Let's consider this from a different perspective. The name Moses received in the desert, the name at the heart of Israel's identity, the name veiled by centuries of growing reverence, the name the priests guarded so seriously they would rather die than profane it, that name, in the Christian tradition, is the name Jesus came to reveal. Not as a phonetic pronunciation, not as a recovered sound, but as a revelation of nature. For the Tetragrammaton was not just a name in the phonetic sense, it was the affirmation of a way of being. The one who is, the one who has always been, the one who will always be. And if there is one thing the New Testament consistently affirms about Jesus, from the prologue of John's Gospel to the final chapter of Revelation, It is precisely that. The Gospel of John begins with one of the most profound phrases in all of religious literature. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That beginning is not merely chronological. In the Hebrew of the Torah, Genesis begins with Bereshit, which doesn't simply mean in the beginning, but in the beginning, in the foundation, at the head of all things. And John uses that resonance deliberately. He is saying that the Word, the Logos, the one who came into the world and dwelt among us, was in that foundational place where being itself began. The one who is before anything is. And when Jesus, in the Gospel of John, uses the construction I am in certain phrases, the Greek construction ego eimi, he is using the exact same words that the Septuagint used to translate the Eye Asher, Eye of the burning bush. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. And there is a moment in chapter 8 of the Gospel of John where that connection becomes so explicit that the religious leaders who were debating with Jesus picked up stones to stone him. Jesus had told them, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad." And they answered him, "You are not even 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham." And Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Ego eimi. Before Abraham existed, I am. Not I was, but I am." The phrase that the Septuagint used to translate the revelation of the divine name in Exodus. And the text says that at that moment they picked up stones to throw at him because they understood exactly what he was saying. When you read the episode of the inscription on the cross, in light of all this context, what you see is not just a curious detail of the Passion narrative. What you see is the closing of an arc that began long before. The name that was revealed in the desert to Moses, the name that was guarded for centuries of priestly tradition, the name that had been veiled for decades of growing reverence, that name appears on the cross, written by a hand that didn't know what it was doing, visible to those who had eyes to see it, impossible to erase because the man who could have erased it said no. And that same name is the name that Jesus said he had revealed, the name he promised he would continue to make known, the name that Paul says God gave him in his letter to the Philippians, the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow. Here I want you to notice something that most readers of the text have never seen, or haven't seen clearly enough. In the Hebrew of Yeshua, the name Jesus in its original form is contained the same root that contains the Tetragrammaton. Yeshua comes from Yehoshua, which in turn comes from two components. The first is the divine name, YHWH. The second is the verb Yasha, which means to save, to deliver, to rescue. Yehoshua, Joshua, Jesus, literally means YHWH is salvation, or the one whom YHWH saves. The name of the one who was hung on the cross already contained within itself the name that Pilate unknowingly wrote over him, the name within the name, the root within the root. This is not a subtlety unknown to Jesus' contemporaries. It was part of language. It was part of the world they lived in. When the angel told Joseph in the dream to name the child Jesus because he would save his people from their sins, that connection between the name and the action the name foretold was immediate to anyone living in that linguistic world. The name already stated what he would do, and what he would do defined him in terms of the name that no one pronounced, but that everyone carried in the collective memory as the name that sustained all of creation. The four Gospels have distinct ways of narrating the events of the Passion, and this plurality of perspectives is itself a sign of historical authenticity. Witnesses to the same event recount what they saw from where they saw it, and no two accounts are identical, because no two witnesses are identical. But there is one element that all four Gospels share in their account of the crucifixion, albeit with varying levels of detail. All four mention the inscription on the cross. Matthew calls it the title of his accusation. Mark calls it the title of his cause. Luke simply says that there was an inscription. And John is the only one who gives the complete inscription in all three languages, and the only one who records the conversation between the priests and Pilate's refusal to change it. It is as if John, the disciple who stood at the foot of the cross, the only one physically present at that moment, had seen something in that scene that the others could not narrate in the same way, because they had not been there to see it with their own eyes. John had a Jewish background. John knew Hebrew. John could read the initial letters of the words in the inscription, and John chose to preserve that detail with a precision unparalleled in the other three Gospels. He doesn't explain it. He makes no comment on the name formed by the first letters. He simply places it there, with the tranquility of someone who knows that the text speaks for itself to those who have ears to listen. And that is exactly what the fourth level of interpretation of the Hebrew text does, the level of sod, the hidden level. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It is there for those who draw close enough. Consider what this means for how we read the Bible. Most of us read it in translation, and that's not a flaw. It's an unavoidable reality. Not everyone can read Hebrew or Greek, and the translations have been done honestly and carefully by people who dedicated their lives to that work. But translation is always an approximation. There's always something that can't cross the bridge from one language to another without losing some dimension of the original. Humor doesn't always cross. Irony doesn't always cross. Sound structure doesn't always cross. And the layers of meaning that live in the form of words, in their roots, in their initial letters, in their resonances with other texts, in the same corpus, those layers almost never cross because they have no equivalent in any other language. What happens with Pilate's inscription is that this dimension of the text, this layer that lives in the first letters of the Hebrew words, is literally invisible in any translation. No one reading the text in Spanish, English, German, or Portuguese can see the name formed by the initials of those four words. The text has to be in Hebrew for that to be visible. And the fact that the Gospel of John specifies that the inscription was written in Hebrew is what makes it possible to see what's there. John doesn't mention it as a casual ethnographic detail. He mentions it because it's relevant, because in that specific language, in that specific text, there is something that other languages cannot reveal. This is one of the reasons why studying the biblical text in its original languages, while not something everyone can do, deserves to be taken seriously. Not to complicate faith, not to make access to truth something reserved for specialists, but because the text is richer than any translation can capture, and that richness is not arbitrary. It is coherent. It is structural. It is the kind of coherence that can only exist if there is an intelligence behind the text that transcends the sum of all the individual intelligences that wrote it. And here we arrive at something that goes beyond the specific episode of the crucifixion, something that this moment in the inscription illustrates, but that is found throughout the entire biblical text. The Bible is not a book that can be read in one sitting and exhausted. It is a text that has the strange quality of becoming deeper the more time you give it. The same passages you read in childhood tell you something different when you read them 20 years later. Texts you thought you fully understood reveal a dimension you hadn't seen when you approached them in the light of a historical detail you didn't know, a linguistic connection that suddenly opens up, a question you asked without realizing the Bible already held the answer. The name above the cross is an example of that depth. It's a detail that has been in the text for 2,000 years, visible to those who know where to look, invisible to those who lack the tools to see it. It wasn't placed there by the priests. It wasn't placed there by Jesus' disciples. It wasn't placed there by any theologian seeking to construct an argument. It was placed there by Pilate, who either didn't know Hebrew well enough to have calculated that, or if he did, never considered that dimension of what he was writing. It was placed there by a concatenation of historical circumstances that produced that specific text with those specific words, in that specific language, at that specific moment, and it was preserved by John, who saw it with his own eyes, who wrote it with his own hands, who chose to include that detail of the conversation between the priests and Pilate because he knew it was important to preserve it, who didn't explain it because there was nothing to explain for someone reading the text through the lens of the Hebrew world, and who left it here for us, after 2,000 years, so that we, who read in a completely different era, in completely different languages, can approach that text and find what he left there for us. What I wrote, I wrote. That phrase of Pilate's resonates in a completely different way when you understand all that it contains. It's not the phrase of a stubborn official. It's not the phrase of a politician defending his ego. It is, though Pilate never knew it, the phrase of an instrument. The phrase of someone who was used to do something beyond his understanding, just as Balaam was used to bless instead of curse, just as Caiaphas was used to prophesy without knowing he was prophesying, just as Cyrus was called anointed without knowing what that title meant. History is full of people who participated in something that only acquired its full meaning from the distance of time or from the perspective of someone who knows the complete text. And we are the ones who know the complete text, or at least can approach it with that intention. We can read Exodus and the Gospel of John together. We can see the name revealed in the desert and the name visible on the cross as part of the same story. We can read Pilate's inscription with the eyes of John's generation, eyes that saw Hebrew and knew what those 4 initial letters meant. And when we do, when we allow ourselves that level of reading, something changes. It doesn't change faith in the sense of replacing it with something else. It deepens it. It anchors it in something more solid than the emotion of the moment, in something more permanent than individual experience, in something that has been in the text for 2,000 years, waiting for someone to come and read it in this way. There is a psalm, Psalm 83, which in its 18th verse, in the Hebrew version, says something that modern translations have handled in various ways. The Hebrew text says that the name of the Eternal, the name of YHWH, is the only name above all the earth, the name that is above every name. And in the letter to the Philippians, in one of the most densely theological texts of the entire New Testament, Paul writes that God exalted Jesus and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow. 2 texts separated by centuries, 2 authors who never met, 2 completely different historical moments. But the same thread, the same name, the same gesture of pointing towards something that is above all human categories. Imagine for a moment what those priests felt as they walked away from Pilate after receiving that refusal. They had asked for a change that seemed reasonable to them, that appeared to be simply a correction for historical accuracy or legal record. And Pilate, without knowing why, without having theologically reasoned what he was saying, had shut the door on them. The name would remain on the wood. The name would remain in the Hebrew. The name would remain above that man's head until the cross was taken down and the body was laid to rest. It would remain in the text of John. It would remain in the memory of those who had been there. It would remain in the historical record that 2,000 years later we can still read. That is the kind of permanence the biblical text possesses. Not the permanence of something preserved because someone powerful protected it, but the permanence of something that survived despite everything that stood in its way, despite empires that fell, despite traditions that hardened, despite centuries that passed, despite translations that captured what they could and left behind what could not be conveyed. The text survived, and within the text, the name survived. Yod, He, Vav, He. Yeshua Hanatzri, Vemelech HaYehudim. The name that was in the name of the man who hung on the cross, the name the prefect wrote without knowing what he was writing, the name the priests asked him to erase, the name that remained because the man who could erase it said no. When the disciples came to understand all of this, when the afternoon of the first day of the week and the following weeks gradually revealed to them what had happened, when they began to reread the scriptures through the lens of their experience, the entire Hebrew text must have appeared to them in a completely new way. It was as if they had been reading a map, suddenly finding the place where they stood, and seeing that every road on the map led directly there. The prophets, who spoke of the suffering servant. The Psalms that described an experience of abandonment and trust that coincided all too precisely with what they had witnessed. The book of Exodus, which spoke of a rescue from slavery that they now understood in a dimension far beyond Egypt. And the inscription on the cross, which in its original language contained the name at the heart of it all, the name that was the key to understanding the entire text, the name that gave coherence to what would otherwise be a collection of scattered texts from a small village in a province of the Roman Empire. The Gospel of John begins at the beginning and ends with a disciple whom Jesus loved standing by an empty tomb. And at the center of that narrative arc is the cross with its inscription, the name on the wood. The name upon which the faith of those who read it and understood what it said was built. The name that tradition has reverently guarded for centuries, sometimes so much so that it has veiled rather than revealed it, but which has never been able to disappear entirely because it is too deeply woven into the text to be removed without undoing the text itself. And that's what I want to leave you with today. Not a definitive theological conclusion, not an argument that answers all the questions, but an invitation. An invitation to approach the Bible with the same disposition as someone who discovers that the book they've read 20 times has a dimension they never saw, because they always read it too quickly, or because they always read it through someone else's eyes, or because they never had the tools to see what was on the surface of the text waiting to be seen. The name is there. Yeshua HaNatzri, V'melech HaYehudim. The first letters tell you what the entire text, from Genesis to Revelation, affirms in different ways, with different voices, at different historical moments. And that coherence, that fabric that connects the name revealed in the desert with the name written on the cross, that fabric that spans centuries and cultures and languages and completely different historical circumstances, that fabric is the strongest argument I know for taking the Bible seriously, not as a document of faith of a particular community, but as a text that has an intelligence behind it that transcends the sum of all the intelligences that wrote it. Read John chapter 19. Read Exodus chapter 3. Read them together. Read them as if they were pages of the same book, because they are. Read the name Moses received in the wilderness, and the name Pilate wrote on the wood. And then read that phrase, "What I wrote, with the ears of someone who has heard everything we have explored together during this time. What was written was written. What was revealed was revealed. What was in the beginning is in the name, and the name is in the text, waiting for you to get close enough to see it."